And we'll be starting the session by doing a preliminary meditation as usual. And in that meditation, we will be revisiting the practice of loving kindness for ourselves. But of course, before that, we will establish the firm foundation of settling our body, speech, and mind in their natural states. So please find a comfortable position that would be an optimal expression of kindness towards our own body. And then while still perhaps adjusting our body and checking all the elements of our physical posture, we can already start the process of releasing all types of physical, verbal, and mental activity by gradually releasing all types of physical tension. And to support that process, we will do an abbreviated and very familiar body scan where we bring our attention to the parts of the body that are currently in touch with the ground, with the earth beneath us. And by staying in that area, by allowing our awareness to really explore these parts of the body, whether that's feet, pelvic floor, our legs, our lower back, or the whole backside of our body, if we're practicing in the supine position. By exploring these parts of the body and the sensations in them, we allow ourselves to let go more deeply, to establish a deeper feeling of connection to the earth. And perhaps to also release everything and anything that's troubling us right now, so that we can just rest deeply, breathing naturally and being still. We then allow this experience of stillness, stability, and relaxation to expand throughout our body. Spending a few moments with our hands and fingers, our shoulders, our facial muscles, and then the entirety of our body as we attend to the natural process of breathing and what we can describe as these tactile waves rushing through the body back and forth as we inhale and exhale naturally. If there are any knots of tension still present in the body, we can simply notice them, but perhaps some of them might be taken away by the natural process of breathing and the benevolent energy of air that circulates through our body, allowing us to let go more and more deeply with each cycle of breathing. And then with our body still resting in this state, we briefly revisit our highest aspirations for our contemplative life, for our practice, for this course, for this session. Bringing those highest psychological or spiritual aspirations to mind and directing our practice towards them. And then with that foundation of a truly beneficial motivation associated with happiness and freedom, both for ourselves and for other beings, with that as our foundation, we focus our attention on ourselves as the person sitting here and resting in this practice. Noticing the state of our body, the state of our mind, our current emotional experiences, if any. And then resting in this awareness of ourselves, of this person sitting here, with the quality that we can simply describe as tenderness or affection or warmth. Not yet loving kindness, not yet wishing for happiness and the causes of happiness, but simply holding ourselves in gentle awareness as if we were holding a baby, a kitten, or a puppy in our hands. Being gentle, being affectionate, trying to project the quality of warmth. Or as if in this act of being aware of ourselves, we wanted to tell ourselves how wonderful that you exist. And so simply resting in the state of care towards ourselves, this body, this mind, this person. Perceiving the process of breathing through the lens of care and tenderness. As if we were our own beloved child, beloved partner, beloved parent. knowing that this person sitting here, of course, as part of their bundle of interdependence, has so many good qualities, talents, gifts. Has aspirations for happiness and the causes of happiness. Some general vision of what that happiness and the path towards it might entail. And then on the basis of this caring, tender perception, generating or activating loving kindness, which is an aspiration. May I have happiness and the causes of happiness. Or may I be happy and have the causes of happiness. Or even more simply, may I be well and happy. Be well in that may I possess balanced, dignified, hedonic well-being. Happy in that may I also experience eudaimonic joy, happiness, flourishing. Choosing one of these ways to express the aspiration of loving kindness and working with it to transform the basic energy of our awareness into the ray of loving kindness projected towards this very person sitting here. And then holding this aspiration, strengthening it with each out breath, if we wish, and returning to it and to the person sitting here every time we seem to get distracted. Returning to the object, that is the person, and the aspiration again and again. For 2 more minutes. And then releasing the aspiration and no longer holding the object in mind, but still resting in spacious clarity, where our mind, our awareness, is not focused on any specific object, but is also not getting lost in involuntary thoughts and images, but rather simply rests in its own place, holding its own ground. With the afterglow of loving kindness. And then returning to the body to ground ourselves and our attention by noticing the sensations in the body, the contact with the earth, the ground that holds us. Mentally dedicating the energy of this practice, once again, to our highest spiritual or psychological aspirations. And then slowly concluding the practice by introducing some movement to the body as we, with a lot of tenderness for the body, rock back and forth, move our fingers and toes, and then slowly, slowly conclude. Thank you. So let's take a moment to just locate ourselves where we are, return to a more active physical state, and remind ourselves, so the twofold perception that we can use in this case for the purpose of this online class. We can see ourselves as a temporary intentional community, and that we are a circle of friends, a circle of peers really, who have gathered together to consider the four immeasurables, to cultivate them in our being, to become agents of the four immeasurables, and also wisdom, of course, living in the different parts of this planet. And of course, wherever we are, that's where the four immeasurables are most needed, because they're needed everywhere. So we are gathering in this little circle, this loving kindness, which Calvin, to strengthen those qualities in ourselves and then transform the world. So we are a community in this case. Even if we're watching this recording later, that doesn't matter. The point is that we are united in terms of generating that positive motivation and looking at these topics together. That being said, as we're sitting in front of our device, whether that's our computer or tablet, or for some people, even a large TV screen, what we're doing is we are creating a little bubble of retreat practice for ourselves. And then we rest in that bubble for as long as we're watching this recording and doing these meditations, to go into the inner lab where we can access our mind, access the appearances, the awareness, everything that we've been discussing. We can use our mindfulness, our introspection, all of these wonderful parts of our mind we can use. And we do the work in this little retreat bubble, even if that little retreat space or the retreat time lasts for the 2 hours that we spend together in this class. So it still does count. Some people with very different motivations count the number of hours that they've spent practicing. And there can be very different considerations around that. But of course, one probably inspiring reason for why some people do that is to remind ourselves that, hey, I can do this. I can keep practicing. I can keep changing the mind. Just accumulating practice, of course, in itself is not a guarantee that we have truly transformed. It can also be, in some cases, done just to advertise ourselves as practitioners or teachers and so forth. So the real issue is to watch our own motivation and to see why we're doing that, if we do. But one good reason is to remind ourselves, hey, I've been able to do all of this beneficial activity, and I've done this in my little bubble, and that bubble is accessible to me wherever I go, really. I can be on my own in my house or in my apartment or in my room or in my little corner. And when I practice, I do go into this little bubble. Of course, it's not perhaps the same as practicing in a cave where masters of the previous generations have practiced before that. And yet, in a way, it is. It is the same in that we are also retreating from things that would obscure us, things that would interrupt with our practice, things that would affect our mind negatively. And we go into a wonderful, wholesome space where we're able to transform our mind into wholesomeness, to cultivate or uncover its positive qualities. So that's another perhaps perception that we can also maintain here. And depending on which one is more inspiring to you, you can either focus on the circle of friends thing or in the bubble of retreat practice thing, or you can go back and forth. But I think using one of these or both of these is a good way to help us stay a bit more focused as we do the Zoom thing or as we watch these recordings, because otherwise we do tend to develop Zoom fatigue and associated states, and that's not fun. That's a bit difficult. So yeah, absolutely. Let's remind ourselves of that and return to the slides, which are in this case simply supporting us in cultivating these beneficial qualities that we then address or refer to as the 4 immeasurables. So we're on session 5, and today we will follow the sequence of topics and considerations in a slightly different manner, in that we will not begin with a very elaborate check-in where we all consider the previous 7 days of practice and then we share things associated with that. We will be doing that in the future for sure. It's very important. But in this case, we'll use a slightly different contemplation and journaling exercise in the beginning of the class. And then whatever we share in the chat would be more closely associated with the topics that are part of that contemplation. But just to once again reestablish the context, we have just finished a preliminary meditation on loving kindness for ourselves. And within this meditation, we started by setting our body, speech, and mind in their natural state. We did a little body scan there just to support that process of releasing and finding stability, finding relaxation, stability, and clarity. Then we established a positive motivation. And then with that, we embarked on the main practice itself, practice of loving kindness for ourselves. We spent some time working on it by using one of the simple phrases, perhaps, that express the aspiration that is loving kindness. And by keeping our attention or our mindfulness on the object of loving kindness, which in this case is this person practicing here. This person meaning each one of us. We're focusing on ourselves, cultivating that loving kindness, strengthening it. That can be done in conjunction with natural breathing, just using the exhalation to strengthen that aspiration a little bit. For people who do find that inspiring, some do not, so then we don't need to do any sort of conjoining there. But we simply rest in the aspiration and we strengthen it with each passing moment. And then we return to it when we seem to have gotten lost. And with that, we spent some minutes cultivating loving kindness for ourselves. And I will briefly mention also that before we started with loving kindness proper, we spent some moments on the quality that is sometimes referred to as tenderness or affection or warmth or simply care. Tewa in Tibetan, just the foundational quality of care, because it is out of this foundational quality of care, of not being indifferent, of having some warmth towards the object of our perception, that loving kindness and compassion and empathetic joy and equanimous openness can then arise. They crystallize out of this more foundational mental quality or mental energy, mental presence, that then becomes actually very important in some much more advanced teachings in the Tibetan contemplative tradition. And this simply means that before we start cultivating actively cultivating loving kindness for ourselves or for any other being, really, we need to have some warmth towards ourselves or other beings. We also need to have some empathy, and we would spend more time cultivating empathy towards others before going into loving kindness for them. But for us, it's not, there is an element of empathy with ourselves as well. There's also just the element of caring. So just surrounding ourselves with that warm attention, caring attention, and then out of that, allowing this quality of loving kindness to arise. And this fusion or union or sequence of caring and loving kindness, tsewa and jampa in Tibetan. We will discuss it a bit later when we refer to some wonderful bits of advice that come from some of the most advanced yogis still living in this world, in the Tibetan contemplative tradition. But suffice it to say that for now, that this play of being warm with ourselves and then generating acting loving kindness, that is a huge gift that we can keep giving to ourselves for days and weeks and months, if not years of practice. And through that, we will see ourselves, if we did ever experience problems with self-esteem, care for ourselves, being kind with ourselves, being patient with ourselves, and yet perhaps also being inspired to change for the better. If we ever noticed some hesitancy with any of that, this combination of tenderness and loving kindness is a wonderful thing to apply, perhaps, to some of our inner wounds, amongst other things. But this is where we can actually start with 5 minutes of journaling, not yet in the chat, just in our own devices or whatever it is that we use. Of course, paper, notebooks, bits of paper, and so forth, answering these two questions or considering them in terms of our own experience, really answering these questions very honestly for ourselves. And then after these 5 minutes are finished, then I will invite you to perhaps share some of your personal observations or experiences in the chat. And of course, that you can do that by sending these messages to me personally, as opposed to messaging the entire group, or you can do it to the entire group. Totally depends on what's comfortable for you. But I will just then read out some of the things that might have come up for some people. But first, let's do 5 full minutes of journaling on these two questions. How easy is it for me to cultivate loving kindness for myself? And we're answering this question with regards to the meditations that we've been doing this whole week. And then what seems to interfere with the process, if anything? So let's do journaling first, and then I will invite you to share in the chat later. With regards to the second question of what seems to interfere with the process, if there's also perhaps a solution to the problem that seems to interfere, you can also mention that in your own notes. Maybe this thing arises, but then it's remedied by that. So that would also be a meaningful addition to the reflection. Yes, what seems to interfere with the process of cultivating loving kindness for myself? If anything, maybe nothing does, but for some people, something would, and many different things might. So that's what we're trying to identify and address if needed. At this point, if you want to share something in the chat, whether sending it to me privately so that it remains anonymous, I will still read it out, but of course anonymously, or sharing it with everyone, please take some time to do that. I would like to, of course, voice these points and address them in some cases. So let's share something there. But if there's nothing you would want to share in the chat, then absolutely just keep journaling or take some time to just rest as you listen. However, my one and only invitation would be to keep it topical so that we are really answering these two questions. So it's not, now is not the time for raising questions with regards to things happening in the world and so forth. We are trying to deal with very specific things in this course. So I'll slowly start reading things out and addressing them gradually. And of course, please continue sharing and typing if you want to share something. Just also as an offering to the group and of course to the circle of friends here that goes beyond space and time in a way. So here's the first observation. It is very difficult to cultivate it. Perhaps it is caused by the high degree of self-criticism and self-demand towards myself that interferes a lot in the process. I was raised in a very rigid family, more like a military barracks, in a home where I constantly had to explain I did everything I did or didn't do regarding the orders I received. Now I live alone, but I continue with the same pattern of behavior. I appreciate the advice. Well, that is, I think, a very clear reminder as to why, amongst other things, we do need these practices, and we do need to, quite literally, and I speak from experience here, accumulate many, many, many hours of loving kindness for ourselves. We literally just need to do that, and we can be very intelligent in terms of how we go about it, because there are many ways of practicing loving kindness for ourselves, formally, informally, using this type of meditation, using that type of meditation, using cognitive behavioral exercises, using other modalities of therapy, combining all of that with mindful breathing, mindfulness to the body, and so forth. All of that, we build a wonderful mechanism, perhaps together creatively, in terms of how all these practices would combine for us. But at the heart of it all lies the indispensable process of cultivating a lot of loving kindness for ourselves. And I did mention that before. I will mention it again. Quite honestly, I think when I think about the fabric of my life and my journey in this life, even my journey as a Buddhist translator, meditation instructor, and so forth, and the person who works with all of this and has worked with all of these practices for in this service capacity for over 15 years now, maybe. A very large milestone in my own life has been doing a retreat on loving kindness, where a large part of that retreat was focused on me, on loving kindness for myself, before progressing towards loving kindness for others. And that was not a 7-day retreat in my case. It was, I think, 2 months in that specific instance. And then I did more loving kindness retreats after that. And I did some shorter ones before. But what's important is not even, taking that time to do loving kindness retreat and just work on ourselves. And unless we can take that time, then it wouldn't work. No, it's not at all that. I also spent months and months before and after that retreat doing a lot of loving kindness practice for myself, because I could see the immediate effect and the immediate change, or at least the possibility of very big changes occurring in my perception of myself and others, were I to continue doing that type of practice, were I not to give up doing it, were I to continue applying this principle, these ideas, these methods. And it's not even so much saying, I did that because I had an incredible amount of, for example, trauma and brokenheartedness and so forth from the past. We all do accumulate what Mark Epstein refers to as the trauma of daily life. And of course, in some cases, also deeper levels of traumatization. All of that happens. And loving kindness is very helpful for all of that. So we all do have that, in a way, conditioning from the past, and we can affect our habits around our mental habits and also our physical conditioning around those things. But the important thing is simply looking at our mind and saying, hey, we have these habits and these frozen parts of our mental energy, these knots in our mental energy right now. And loving kindness might, that's a working hypothesis, help with that. But to make sure it does help with that, we need to invest a lot of hours into first ourselves and then into others. And in a way, even though an important part of it is finding intelligent solutions and intelligent strategies for how to cultivate it, what we can't probably avoid is simply investing many hours into it. So reminding ourselves, hey, indeed, each minute of loving kindness practice for myself that I accumulate goes towards that goal. And I will be facing obstacles in this process, but that's a meaningful quest nonetheless. So slowly, slowly, I will keep working and I will be undoing these knots. And they will be undoing themselves automatically, quite honestly. And then slowly, slowly, I will see an improvement. And those improvements might come very, very cautiously, inadvertently. They would first not be truly noticeable, but over time, they would emerge in our experience, and then would be able to say, hey, I have become much kinder with myself, and I have become kinder with others. And I think some people present here have known me for many years now. I think even as they observed me doing that practice, over years, they have noticed softening in who I am, not in terms of me becoming perhaps less focused or losing my resolve and just chilling all the time, even though chilling is also a wonderful skill to acquire, just being able to relax and enjoy and harvest joy and so forth. Not that, but just becoming less neurotically hard on myself and others, maybe. So the second observation here, it has become easier over time to cultivate loving kindness for myself My Vajrayana teachers in the United States have taught me the practice of evoking benefactors and feeling immersed in their love and care. So this has become an integral part of my practice in recent years. However, blocks still come up from time to time, particularly when I'm under stress. Old habits of self-judgment and not feeling good enough can arise. But in that case, I again call to mind my benefactor's presence and their care. I may also try to open to and accept them in a practice called compassionate presence to feelings, what Tsoknyi Rinpoche sometimes calls handshake practice. Absolutely, and indeed, handshake practice is a very wonderful way of being tenderly present with some of our emotional, mental, and cognitive experiences. So it's very helpful for that. There are also techniques which are more in the vein of immediate remedies for overactivation or being unstable, not experiencing the space of emotional stability at times and so forth. And some people do indeed benefit from practices where they imagine the presence of their benefactors, either real or trans-historical, all sorts of methods like that, that essentially still all revolve around two quintessential things: being able to simply tenderly attend to this person sitting here, and being able to act, that's just tenderness or care, and then actively being able to actively wish for happiness and the causes of happiness, which is loving kindness proper, maitri, metta. So these qualities are sort of at the heart of this, and then we use a large variety of techniques that can support that. And some of those techniques would be very secular, or for some people in their perception, even associated with pop psychology or self-help and so forth, such as, for example, spending a lot of time sending loving kindness to ourselves in the past. Some people think, oh, that's not very Buddhist. You take a picture of yourself in the past and you send some loving kindness to that baby that perhaps might have had very difficult experiences and needed that loving kindness, but never received it from the parents and so forth. And people think, oh, that's just self-help, or that's pop psychology. Well, the point is not whether it's self-help or pop psychology. The point is whether it can indeed make us more kind and tender with ourselves and with others. And if it does, it doesn't mean which hashtags we apply to it, of pop psychology or Vajrayana Buddhism or whatever. That's not the point. The point is that it worked, the medicine worked. But of course, it wouldn't work for everyone. Not everybody needs that type of practice, because there's also a large variety of other methods. And yet what we can't perhaps circumvent is just the need to rest with kindness for ourselves and cultivate and strengthen or uncover it. And then from us, once we have worked on sort of this, and I will use this term again, and I will keep using it throughout this course, as we work with this bundle of interdependence, and we activate loving kindness for it, and as we start succeeding in that, then extending that loving kindness to others would become so much more easy, and that process would become so much more stable, which is what we're trying to achieve, a stable experience of immeasurable loving kindness directed at all beings. Well, the stability starts with this person sitting here, because this is the person we know most intimately. There are highs and lows, what we think are our shameful thoughts and secrets, and what we think are our successes and victories. All of that is available to us. We know it, even though, of course, we still tend to lie to ourselves or repress things and so forth. In general, we know this person more than we do anybody else. So if we're able to then hold all of this with tenderness and loving kindness in union, and then also compassion and empathetic joy and equanimous openness, all that together, if we're able to hold this person in this embrace, then others would follow, or at least we can then move on to others, and it would be more stable. Next observation. It is not easy. The self-critical voice is very strong. I spend many hours of the day wondering whether my existence is of any benefit to others, and usually I conclude that it's not. If I don't think that I am of benefit to others, then my self-esteem is low. Sometimes it feels like I'm dragging myself through life. Thankfully, these loving kindness practices help me to calm those voices for a time. Focusing on breath or deliberate movement in asana practice allow a moment of calming those voices, and then I can get closer to practicing loving kindness towards myself. Absolutely true and very relatable. It is true that it is true that we want to have a meaningful existence, and meaningful existence means bringing benefit to others, amongst other things. And as some people know, when Martin Seligman was doing research on genuine well-being, which is the psychological, perhaps, way of describing eudaimonic happiness that we have been talking about so much. One of the major criteria, one of the major points that define genuine well-being was feeling that our existence is meaningful. And of course, that sense of meaning doesn't necessarily come from a higher authority or something like that. It comes from us knowing that what we're doing is of benefit and is in accordance with what we see as meaningful and beneficial. But then that's where there is the dance between doing something and feeling it mirrored back at us. There's the dance of us offering stuff, and then the world telling us, yes, that has been very helpful. Thank you so much. We're so grateful. And that is a very interesting dance, even for people who are bringing immeasurable benefit to this world, because in a way, there's never enough reflection. There's never going to be enough of that reflection. There's never going to be enough gratitude. There's never going to be enough praise. There's never going to be enough, I don't know, for financial gratitude even, or not enough attention, not enough people listening to what we have to offer, to our bits of advice, not enough people reading our books, not enough people thanking us for our cooking and so forth. So in a way, it is an endeavor where we are destined to not get enough. And yet it is important to get something, right? It is important to have some kind of mirroring back. Because even the Buddhist tradition admits that. The Buddhist tradition talks about the two witnesses to our goodness and to our unwholesome behavior. And although one of these witnesses is ourselves, because we know most intimately what we do and what we want to do and our victories, and once again, things we're not so good at, there's also the other witness of others, and that's also not something to be completely discarded. Lest we fall into complete self-obsession and we just ignore the effect that our actions have on others. So there's always the dance of intent and impact. And yet we slowly learn to put a little bit more emphasis on the intent, and also being very aware of the impact, but not in terms of always getting enough confirmation from the world, because that's simply not going to happen, at least not as much as we want it to. And yet, in that dance, when we come back to the loving kindness practice, the formal meditation on loving kindness, and even before we begin actual loving kindness, as we hold ourselves in tenderness, we first remind ourselves from our own side that, hey, it's wonderful that you exist, right? Just holding ourselves in this gentle awareness, that in itself counteracts that feeling of, I might not be bringing anything to this world. I might as well not exist. So this is why we do that element of tsewa, just resting with it, because knowing, hey, you do exist. That's joyful. This already counteracts that I might as well not. And then from there, of course, it's not enough that we simply exist. We want to be genuinely, meaningfully happy and well. So that's where we start wishing for happiness and well-being. And amongst those things, of course, what we want for ourselves is to feel how much our existence is meaningful and beneficial. So that would be an aspect of eudaimonic well-being that we want for ourselves to have, and that we want others to have as well. Because when they start practicing eudaimonic qualities and activities, we want them to also feel not feel despondent, not feel desperate, not feel lost, not feel alone. That's very profound, I think, in a way. I think, well, I mean, it's all very profound. All these practices are very profound, but this is where practices associated with kindness are, in a way, more emotionally challenging, then if we were to gather here and talk about practices focused on insight, the topic of emptiness, interdependence, and so forth, those are all absolutely crucially important. But in discussing those, we wouldn't perhaps be able to share these very, very intimate feelings of sometimes I don't even know if I do need to exist or that I'm bringing anything of benefit to this world. And I think we all might have these feelings. I certainly do. And then what's beautiful about having practice is that we're able to hold them, not fully believe them, and then allow them to dissolve, slowly, slowly dissolve in the boundless space of loving kindness and other measurables. So that's where the beauty of these four methods, the measurables, comes in. What seems to interfere with the process? The answer is selfishness. Yeah, selfishness is an interesting quality to explore, and that we'll look at it in greater depth later when we talk about projecting loving kindness to others and so forth. And yes, of course, it largely depends on what we do describe as selfishness, because, well, how we define selfishness, because there are different definitions and different ideas about it in different traditions. But what's interesting to point out, even at this stage, is perhaps the difference between the mental state that we could describe as selfishness or self-centeredness, self-absorption, just being selfish, really, and self-care, self-love, loving ourselves, loving kindness for ourselves. So what's the difference? How do these mental states resemble each other? And then what's also the difference between them? That's an interesting exploration, not just in terms of writing definitions, making lists and so forth, but also in terms of actually looking at our own mind, which is the emphasis of the great perfection and great seal traditions, these very advanced practices in Tibetan Buddhism that have a lot to do with the four measurables, actually. The emphasis in those traditions is on look at your own mind and tell me what's happening there, see what's happening there, discern these mechanisms. And yet through all of them, see the underlying radiant spaciousness. So, but it's not just the radiant spaciousness, it's also seeing the mechanisms first. So this is where we see the mechanism of selfishness, we see the radiant beauty of genuine loving kindness for ourselves, and we learn to see the difference between them, because one of them will lead to the radiant spaciousness and the other one will completely cut us off from it. So absolutely. Next observation, not easy at all. It feels like a huge fake mostly, although sometimes I feel little glances of warmth towards myself. Tenderness aspect worked very, very helpful this time. As for interferences, in my case, I guess a constant amount of fear, anxiety really disturbed my mind. Once again, I would say very relatable for me personally, because I also, amongst the 5 hindrances that Dr. Wallace, of course, describes in the 3rd chapter of the book, the 5 hindrances to any concentration practice. They're very clearly described in the Pali tradition. It's very wonderful to know them, even if we primarily associate our practice with a Tibetan lineage or the East Asian lineage, or really not Buddhism at all, no Buddhism at all. Just wonderful to know about those 5 hindrances. And there are more playful ways of describing them. Sylvia Burstein has a wonderfully playful way of talking about them. There are more serious descriptions, and the one in the 3rd chapter of the Four Immeasurables book is quite technical and precise. And yet we can see that amongst those 5 energies, the energy of anxiety and fear or uncertainty, well, actually, the energy of anxiety and the energy of afflictive uncertainty, they're 2 interrelated energies. We look at the mind and we see that, hey, mind is not stable, it's kind of all wobbly. And yet, indeed, some glimpses would come through. So later on, we would talk about how, well, first of all, 2 things. One way to keep getting those glimpses and strengthening them is just to do the practice. However, in addition to that, all the traditions that work with these methods, including the Tibetan tradition, of course, have developed incredible toolkits for strengthening our practice so that we get more and more glimpses at a faster pace, perhaps. And this is where all the additional methods, or yeah, we could call it that, of devotionals, special aspiration prayers, inspiring visualizations, even surrounding ourselves with inspiring materials and pictures and books and so forth, all of that comes into play. It's not because, from a psychological point of view, from the point of view of Buddhist psychology, contemplative psychology, mindfulness psychology, so the psychology of contemplative practice, it's not because we want to be all holy, and that's why I have all these amazing tankas behind me and around me. As some people know, I'm staying in an apartment that belongs to a wonderfully kind Tibetan family, which for 5 generations has transmitted the knowledge of painting tankas, or these Tibetan icons painted on fabric. And so it's not that the family transmitted it just because it looks all holy. It's because being surrounded by, for example, images of different kinds, there are many different images here. It's like a museum, essentially, can have a powerful effect on our mind in terms of doing these practices. So I am, in a way, very blessed to be surrounded by this. But this is where we all construct our space of loving kindness in terms of arranging stuff around ourselves so that it can support our meditation. And that's something that Tibetan texts talk about elaborately. But then another thing is, even if we don't have all of those aspects available to us elaborately, we're not in our special meditation room with all the special things to inspire us, and we can't spend hours chanting first before meditating. Well, we have our little bubble, and within that little bubble, which travels with us essentially, we have available to us some of the simpler techniques for inspiring our mind. So we'll look at some of them later, and especially when we do the 5-day loving kindness retreat, that's where we spend even more time on those additional facets of practice. Now we're focused on the quintessential parts. Later, we'll also discuss the additional supportive elements. Next observation: it becomes easier every time I meditate on loving kindness for myself. I try to feel myself as a human being with all my imperfections. Absolutely, that's the essence of how it goes, really. We keep practicing and we keep reminding ourselves that I'm a human being just like everyone else. I'm not worse than others, even though it might feel that way, but we have to keep reminding ourselves we're all human. And I'm not more fierce than others either. I'm not like incredibly glorious, amazing, la-di-da, but we're all humans. That's what His Holiness the Dalai Lama makes a huge emphasis on. We're all 7+ billion people living on this planet. We're all equal from some points of view. We're not equal in terms of material wealth, for example, right? Or access to education, or access to human rights, and so forth. That's a big thing to discuss. But in terms of our potential and the fact that we all have amazing human intelligence and all the good qualities, and we also have unwholesome habits. From that point of view, we're sort of the same. And that's a balanced way of seeing ourselves. A fixation on the qualities that makes me compatible or unworthy of that loving kindness. That's the next observation with regards to what seems to interfere with the process. Yes, absolutely. And as was pointed out before, that can happen on the basis of our conditioning, where others around us have been incessantly reminding us of all the ways in which we are not that good, not worthy, and so forth. And some people do absolutely benefit from the psychoanalytical process around that, working with a therapist and so forth to find where that conditioning comes from. However, that still does not replace the need to change how we decide to deal with that in the here and now. So these processes can be absolutely complementary, but in the here and now, we can say, hey, these thoughts, I'm going to put them to the side. I'm going to gradually release them. I'm going to not believe them fully. These thoughts about how I'm not good enough, how these qualities make me undeserving of happiness. And these qualities, or these positive thoughts, these balanced, realistic thoughts about me, the ones, for example, that say, hey, I'm a human being like everyone else, we can focus on those. I seem to always put others' needs first. I can become highly motivated and energized if I'm doing for others, but not the same for myself. I really don't know what actually interferes when it is for me. I'm just aware of the level of energy in my being to take action when it is for someone else. Well, this is where the Tibetan Buddhist tradition has a very helpful logic that is actually described by Shantideva, this great Indian contemplative / poet that / tantric master that some people of course, know about as one of the favorite authors of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, and a source of so many wonderful quotes that we will be using even throughout this course. Well, Shantideva, when he talks about the practice of enthusiastic effort or vigor or perseverance or diligence, so different ways of translating it, vidya in Sanskrit, essentially heroic perseverance, enthusiastic effort. When he talks about that practice, he keeps reminding us that, well, if this smartphone by the name of Lobsang Tenpa gets completely discharged, this is of no use to other beings. So we do need to keep our batteries charged, not by overindulging in simply the hedonic joy of lying on the couch, perhaps, and not doing anything at all, but also not going to the extreme of, oh, I'll eat one berry a day and then I'll work for the sake of others for 23 hours, 59 minutes. And that's going to be my Dharma practice, unless we truly are resourced to do that. And there are some amazing yogis and yoginis who can do incredible feats of not needing sleep, not needing food, needing very little food, needing very little time for themselves, their bodies and mind, and so forth. But we have to be really, really very realistic with where we are. And for most of us, a large part of keeping our battery charged is supercharging this little flower here with loving kindness and tender awareness. And then from it, allowing it to flow towards others. Actually, the more genuine our loving kindness for ourselves becomes, and the more it becomes balanced with loving kindness towards others, the less there is an experience of separation there. Because eventually in the four immeasurables, that separation becomes very, 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 very thin. That separating line becomes very thin. And eventually when wisdom comes into the mix even more strongly, then that separation completely, in a way, dissolves on a certain level, not conventionally, but on some levels of practice or some levels of perception. And so then being kind to ourselves, being kind to others, it would be the same thing. But for now, we do need to actively work on keeping this battery charged. And that also means making intelligent choices about how we do stuff for ourselves. So how do I look out for my health, for my need to be well rested, my need for communication, for intelligent conversations, and for feeling validated in my spiritual practice and so forth, all of that, yeah, making wise choices there. I have difficulty cultivating loving kindness for myself because I'm constantly under severe condemnation by my implacable self-critic and judge. Perfectionism is my dominant trait. Very good observation, very important observation to make, and then to surround with the spaciousness of the loving kindness practice for ourselves. So we identify sort of what's the main obstacle for us, and then slowly we do away with it by repeating the practice again and again. When I was asked many years ago to write a list of 3 things that I was grateful for about myself on a daily basis, I discovered how difficult that really was for me at that stage, because it unfolded for me the levels of self-blame and self-negation of which I was unaware. And that was my stepping stone to becoming aware of the areas of my thinking and behavior where I could offer loving kindness to myself and turn around that negativity pattern. Absolutely, yes. And such coaching exercises, really, as thinking about 3 things that we're grateful for about ourselves, or thanking ourselves for 3 things we have successfully accomplished today. That's another exercise. Or even being able to delight in our own presence throughout the day, as if we were spending time with a wonderful friend and telling them, hey, I'm so happy to be with you. But being able to do that to ourselves, for ourselves, with regards to ourselves, 3 times a day, another exercise. Very helpful, and so difficult to do sometimes. Because of course, instinctively, we want to avoid the extreme of narcissism. And narcissism is in psychiatry can be a full-blown disorder, which is very harmful for both to ourselves and to others. So instinctively, we try to steer away from that, from self-obsession, from complete misperception of reality and so forth. But then we fall like we tend to do, because we're not good at finding middle way, all of us. That's why Buddhism insists on the middle way, because it's so difficult for us to grasp. We fall into the other extreme of self-denial, self-deprecation, and simply just not seeing the joyful sides of things, including not being able to delight in us, in ourselves, in, hey, I might not be the biggest potato on the block, I might not be the most beautiful rose, but, and that's a wonderful example from the Christian tradition of the spirituality of Saint Therese of Lisieux. I'm a little flower. That's pretty cool. I'm not the biggest, best, most beautiful. Maybe I'm a cactus flower, amongst other things. That's pretty good anyway. Even cactus flowers are flowers, and they're beautiful in their own way. So being able to see that takes effort sometimes. And if it comes natural to some people, then all the more joy and power to you, then it would be easier to cultivate loving kindness. Working with a therapist who offers internal family systems therapy has also reinforced the benefits of the benefactor and compassionate presence of feelings Buddhist practice. I do. Yes, some people do indeed benefit from internal family systems therapy and other therapeutic modalities. Cognitive behavioral therapy, if we have limiting beliefs about our ability to be lovable, and there are many others. I'm not going to go through a long list, but just, of course, therapeutic work would support all of this, and doing the practice would also support it. So for people who have access to both, they would just get both types of benefit. If not, at least we can work on cultivating loving kindness actively, and we can be mindfully aware of the interfering patterns. That's a good beginning. Then if one day we also feel we need to gain access to professional counsel for a little bit of time or for a long time, absolutely, we have the freedom, and we would ideally, hopefully, have the freedom, the ability to do that. But if not, at least we have access to the therapeutic duo of tender awareness and loving kindness. It's difficult to imagine treating myself with the same tenderness as I do a puppy. I think I'm getting better at doing this. I think it's largely because I'm not accustomed to doing this. Also, I'm becoming more aware that treating myself negatively, especially when I'm in a depressed mood, is damaging to me, and I'm treating myself with greater care. Well, how wonderful. And yes, indeed, it does all boil down to habituation, to being familiar with these mental habits, these ways of treating ourselves, and these attitudes. But all four immeasurables are attitudes. We can then talk about how some of them are aspirations, some of them are not aspirations, and so forth, but they are all certainly attitudes, types of awarenesses, modulations of awareness. So modulating awareness into loving kindness for ourselves and also into tenderness for ourselves is sometimes a new thing, relatively new thing, but we're getting better at it if we keep repeating. Moderately easy to send loving kindness to self, but with a low intensity. It feels my heart has atrophied over the pandemic years, in protective mode from political realm, physical health, and in this safe retreat bubble and other safe sangha, as I'm reconnecting, to allow my heart to send loving kindness to myself. Barriers have been a triggered trauma response within my body from global, regional, and local divisions in political thought and public safety. My little dog barking spontaneously has also been a barrier that triggers anger within me when I try to meditate. But I'm now continuing my meditation practice in spite of his interruptions, and I send him loving kindness too. Returning to my meditation practice with the support of this CCN group and my local Sangha here in the Midwest and my own higher wisdom, with an aspiration to be kind and loving to self and to others. Absolutely. And yes, indeed, when there are other beings interrupting, one of the best responses is two responses there. We can project loving kindness to them. We'll talk about this a little bit today, or we can use the noise, the sound, as a reminder to activate loving kindness more strongly. And yet another response is to, for as long as they're in the space of our awareness, we can switch the label to we, right? Instead of focusing on just then this bundle of interdependence and thinking me, which we would still need to do for some time. Since they're quite close, we can think, may we? This bundle, that bundle, this flower, this flower. May we have happiness and the causes of happiness. So 3 strategies: using the sound as a reminder, sending loving kindness their way, and then going back to ours, or just using the we thing of, we were together. We're in the same boat. We're all in the same boat in a way. So hopefully that will help us. I feel the practice comes very natural to me. However, I could practice it much more. I tend to get very self-critical in areas in which I set challenging goals and never feel good enough. In those moments, I try to accept those feelings well, as well as the critical mind, stop taking myself so seriously and turn to gratitude for all the love and effort I have invested in those areas. This is also a good reminder that in a way, our self-critical voice would only fully go away when we also succeed in wisdom practices. So we're building a very firm foundation with kindness practices, but to undo some of the habitual thinking processes, we would also need wisdom practice that comes through the insight methods of for applications of mindfulness or meditations on interdependence and emptiness and so forth. There is a variety of different techniques there. Or simply, or not simply, but eventually the advanced methods of great seal and great perfection or great middle way or cutting off and so forth. There's these specific techniques for cultivating wisdom. But initially, just saying, hey, that's a conditioned response. And it's not always true. So Tokten Rinpoche has been mentioned today already, and he has this very, very wonderful mantra or slogan, actually, a wonderful mind training slogan to use for some of our emotional experiences and the way they present reality, and also for some of our thinking patterns. And that mantra is very simple: real but not true. Slogan, that's slogan. It's not mantra in the Buddhist sense, but it's a slogan. It's a thing to remind ourselves of. So our inner critic starts yapping, and then we say, real but not true. Real is that I hear the voice, okay, it's resounding in my head quite loudly, but not true as in it's not an accurate description of reality, or also not helpful either. Of course, we could do better eventually, but contextually, we did everything we could. We will keep trying to do better. So equanimously, we can progress towards better achievements, better projects, better work, but losing ourselves in the cycle of self-criticism, it's not true in that we did do contextually what we could under the influence of all the limiting factors. So that's a helpful thought to have as well. And the last observation here, I've been slowly making headway with this meditation. I find it really lifts me up as I tend to be self-critical. I find when I rest in openness and tenderness, rather than thinking about what makes me happy, is a way to avoid interferences. Absolutely. And yes, we do need a little bit of both in that tenderness is, of course, the foundation, Tewa, once again, and then loving kindness, the focused aspiration is loving kindness. So to cultivate loving kindness, we would need the more focused aspirations. But it's true that we don't need at all to every time do the analysis of, oh, what would bring me there? That's why we can on occasion do Vision Quest, the practice of 4 questions, but we don't need to always just do that. As I've mentioned, the meditation that Andy Wilson will guide us in next week, the inner journey, it's a very different type of Vision Quest. But in my experience as an interpreter and a translator for classes that included that practice, I've seen people become more open to this vision of genuine well-being that's available, the journey there, the qualities that support us on that journey, and yet having some trust in that process. So we're less critical and less also anxious about it, because we know, well, it is a journey. It takes time to walk the path slowly. So we'll be, real but not true can mean a truth that hides a deeper truth. It can in some cases, but it's also not always that deep, in that sometimes I can have a thought that's just misrepresenting reality, and it's real for me, but it's not true. So I don't need to find greater depth where I can just notice, hey, that's just a neurotic pattern. Bye. It's, for instance, where I'm becoming anxious over nothing. Anxious over nothing in that, okay, I am not in danger right now as I'm sitting in this apartment. Generally, existentially, yes, the planet is experiencing climate crisis, politically happening. This is happening. My personal life, that is happening. I'm trying to figure out this and that and the other thing. Yeah, of course, there's always room for working with things, but in this moment, in this second, this overactivation of my anxiety is out of balance. It's part of my evolutionary conditioning and also my mental habits. But right now I can say, hey, I am sitting on firm ground. I am surrounded by nice environment. I have a cup of tea. So from that point of view, I'm not under the attack of aliens or anything like that. So it's much simpler than that. Of course, beyond, there's always a deeper truth, but we can then go beyond that deeper truth and keep on going all the way to the ultimate radiant, spacious emptiness of things, or the great perfection of everything that exists, and stop there and say, hey, well, it's all perfect. So why worry either, right? But we usually don't do that because we don't want to do the spiritual bypass thing. Instead, with regards to this slogan, we can just say, hey, this thought is skewing reality. So now let's go to some more considerations with regards to loving kindness, but also the ensuing immeasurables. These would be relevant to all of them. And this is something that we will add to our practice from this class on. So first of all, the division into formal and informal meditation, which would be familiar to some people, or actually many or most, in that ideally we would need both. And this is where Dr. Wallace gives the analogy of, well, there are two main reasons for why we can't just do the formal practice. We also need to add the informal component. But first, let's define them. So formal meditation happens when we assume a stationary position, supine, sitting upright, or standing, in some cases also walking, but in a specific way. And then with regards to loving kindness, we generate loving kindness for a specific period of time. So formal meditation is usually timed, and some people ask, well, how did they time it before the invention of smartphones and so forth, watches or clocks? Well, for instance, in the Chinese tradition, practitioners would use sticks of incense. So for as long as the stick is still burning, meditation would last. Some cultures used water clocks or sand clocks and so forth. So just different types of technology. However, in our case, it's not an issue. We have access to different digital devices which can measure time. And we also have access, for the first time in history, compared to previous generations of practitioners, we have access to guided practice. So in the past, you would only get instructions from your teacher, and maybe they would guide you in meditation, but then they would send you off. You'd have to reconstruct the practice from memory or from using a text and so forth. Whereas these days, you can listen to a truly experienced meditation practitioner, true yogini, a true yogi guiding you in practice 7 billion times. So you press play and it's right there. So when we listen to guided meditations, it's also formal practice. So a specific period of time, usually, that ideally we determine in advance. So it's not a very good habit to play it by the ear with formal meditation. So maybe I'll meditate for 3 minutes, maybe for 15, maybe for 3 hours. I'll see how it goes. That's not a very healthy habit. They say, at least my teachers say that, it's better to in advance decide on a specific period that we would stick to, even if things are not flowing very smoothly, or even if things are flowing very smoothly and we want to continue. So if we're right at the end of 15 minutes or 20 minutes or 24 minutes, and we still have a lot of energy in us, well, we can take a short break, do another short session and see how that goes. And that would be better than just sitting 3 hours uninterruptedly today and then doing just 3 minutes tomorrow, and then it's all very uneven. Of course, there's still the outer circumstances of what we can do, but sticking to a certain length, committing to a certain length of sitting is a wonderful habit. And it's also, of course, quintessential to slowly commit to some kind of daily practice that we don't skip. And different traditions use different techniques to teach us to do that. And the Tibetan tradition puts a strong emphasis on the idea of practice commitments, which for many people are associated with things like recite a certain number of mantras per day, recite this text, this liturgy, and so forth, do these visualizations every day. And then it's implied that within those outer frameworks, we insert practices like loving kindness, compassion, mindfulness of breathing, mindfulness of the mind, and so forth. So the outer thing of mantras, visualizations, liturgies, so forth is just the outer container for these inner techniques. But what tends to happen in the West generally is that people still keep the container. They recite the thing, they recite the mantras, they quickly go through visualizations, but they don't take the time to insert the meditations, the quintessential, the juicy meditations of loving kindness and interdependence and mindfulness, of breathing and so forth, all of those content side things. So that's where it becomes a little bit unbalanced. And that's what we're trying to rectify by finding, once again, the middle way. It's wonderful to do those practices that form the container and inspire our mind. And that includes all the mantras and visualizations and so forth. They form the outer context. And then we put the pith into it. We put the juice into it by doing these practices such as loving kindness. So that's what we try to do formally. And then informal meditation implies that we generate the aspirations of loving kindness, and we would just replace the words for compassion and empathetic joy and equanimity and so forth. But in this case, we generate the aspirations of loving kindness while engaging in other activities, usually without timing ourselves. So maybe we'll just go into the store. It's not a formal meditation. It's not a formal walking meditation either. It's just going to the store. Maybe we're doing some work that just involves using our body, cleaning, for example. Or maybe we're even in a discussion with others, or we're sitting at a work meeting, work Zoom meeting, whatever it might be. We can insert a few seconds or a few minutes of loving kindness here and there. And even doing a few seconds of loving kindness is actually strengthening the skill already. Because quite obviously, even if we do a lot of formal meditation, let's say you do a whole full hour of formal meditation, loving kindness per day, which is quite a lot, you still have 23 hours left without that. So that would mean that for 1 hour you cultivate or you strengthen the positive habits of loving kindness, and for 23 hours you're still stewing in the old habits of not being too kind with yourself, not being too kind with others, being very self-critical with yourself and with others, and in some cases even antagonistic. So that would not be helping us to progress too fast. However, even teeny tiny bits of informal practice here and there already transform the overall fabric of our experience. And the analogy that Dr. Wallace likes to give is a little bit of seasoning. So maybe you cooked a big bowl of rice, and that's our daily life. But even a little bit of seasoning put into that rice can go a long way towards making the flavor completely different for the whole thing. So the amount is relatively insignificant compared to the amount of rice, but the change is very profound. And in the same way, a little bit of informal practice helps. An observation here, my teachers focus a lot on the pith instruction, short practice, many time for meditation practices. Yeah, absolutely true. That's not just your teachers, that's in general the overall advice that the Tibetan tradition gives for specifically shamatha practices or concentration practices. And that's what's mentioned, I think, also even in the Immeasurables book, but also in other books on concentration practice in the Tibetan tradition. Because initially, if we try to squeeze our mind into concentrating perfectly for many minutes at a time and then many hours and so forth, well, the stress is just going to kill us essentially, in that we're going to, instead of going into the union of relaxation, stability, and clarity, we're going to enter something that is more likely to be tension, being all over the place, and not having clarity at all, because we jumped too high, too fast. So instead, teeny tiny bits where we can strengthen the three qualities and also do the practice that we're focusing on, such as loving kindness. That's slowly habituating ourselves to a different mode of being. But that's still formal practice. Informal practice, which also, of course, that advice can cover that, but it's worth mentioning on its own as well. Just a few moments of loving kindness here and there. So quite literally, what would that look like? What would we do? And hopefully we do need to do it in the forthcoming week of practice. What we do is we stop sometimes, and maybe, or we don't stop, but we mentally stop. We're still walking on the road to that supermarket, but we spend a little bit of time wishing ourselves happiness and the causes of happiness, or first holding ourselves in tender awareness, then wishing for happiness and the causes of happiness, applying proper loving kindness, then doing the same thing even as we're sitting in a Zoom meeting, perhaps, if the moment does not require very focused attention from our side, or as we're cooking food, may I be happy and have the causes of happiness. You do as you stir the pot. And then beyond that, it can be ideally integrated with everything and anything that we do, which is why in some texts on practice in the Tibetan tradition, you would even find advice on how to integrate meditation with sitting on the toilet and walking, opening doors, closing doors, and so forth. And that's usually described with regards to some slightly more advanced practices. But the same logic can then be extrapolated into these simple things like loving kindness, relatively simple. We begin with this, and once we've built this, then further layers and levels can follow. So informal practice, not to be forgotten, very, very important. And some people, as I've been teaching these courses for a long time, well, comparatively long for me, it's certainly not long for people who have been practicing for decades. But a lot of people share that, yeah, maybe didn't find so much time for formal practice today or this week. Things happening, and it's not always easy to commit to stability in our practice. But at least I've been able to do some informal practice here and there and again and again and again. And that already changed my experience. So that's what's important. However, ideally, what do we aspire for? Both. Some formal, some informal. Or some formal practice and an immeasurable ocean of informal practice. That's the best combo. And also for formal practice, sometimes we can do retreats, which is why I so much treasure the opportunity to do loving kindness retreats. They're usually very powerful and transformative and very easygoing compared to some other types of retreats, because some retreats really leave you high and dry. There's just a lot of stuff happening there, and it can be quite intense, even to go through insight practices in a very focused manner. But of course, because kindness is about being kind, we do tend to be quite tender with ourselves and with each other, and then it's still transformative. So also adding that to our mental agenda, maybe at some point I'll be able to do a one-day loving kindness retreat for myself, and we'll talk about the format for that, suggested schedules, and so forth. Of course, that can all be discussed and arranged, but just in general, knowing formal and informal in different variations and combinations. Then a little bit about walking meditation and loving kindness. The same logic would then apply to compassion and beyond. But for now, let's talk about how to do walking meditation on loving kindness formally and informally. And walking meditation is a large part of the Buddhist tradition. It was taught by the Buddha and then practiced by successive generations in very different ways, perhaps in different countries, but still to this day, all major traditions still maintain these practices and there are multiple forms. However, in this case, I'm going to describe sort of the basic forms that we can use. These are the suggested types of loving kindness walking practice that I would recommend for this course and for this week specifically. So of course, once again, you'll get the slides and the recording, but you can just open the slide and look at it and be like, which one do I want to do today? You choose one and you apply it and you journal about the results. Or you don't, but you just mentally note, hey, how was it? And then we can discuss that next week. Well, first formal. So formal, to remind you, means that there's the process of timing ourselves happening. So to do formal meditation on loving kindness while walking, we would, for example, set a timer on our phone, put the phone in our pocket or in our bag or in our purse, and then start walking. But usually to do loving kindness meditation, walking meditation formally, we walk back and forth on a short track. So maybe 10 steps each way, for example, 10 large steps each way, or 20 steps. Usually it's 10, 15, something like that. Or an alternative is to walk around an object if you have a circular path. And that's why there's the great stupa of Bodhanath here in Nepal, one of the biggest Buddhist stupas in the world. What people do is they walk around it. And that's probably around 7 minutes to circumambulate the whole thing. So it's quite a very large track. But if you have something circular like that, then you can walk around. If you walk on a track back and forth, you walk one way slowly, then you turn around, you walk backwards, and then you do it for the duration of the practice, for as long as your timer is still ticking. But how do you do that? Well, to do the formal practice, this is the suggestion here. With each step, you take very slow, very mindful steps. You strengthen the aspiration of loving kindness. So with some other types of walking meditation, you would focus on the sensations in your feet, on your breath. You would do analytical practices, insight practices, and so forth. So many things we could do while walking formally in meditation. Not at all here. Really doesn't matter what your feet are feeling. Even your breath, it just needs to flow naturally, but you don't need to focus on it in any special way for this practice. Instead, with each slow step, as you put your foot down, you think, may I have happiness and the causes of happiness. Then you rest with that. And when you're ready, you take the next step with your other foot, you put it down, and once again, may I have happiness and the causes of happiness, or whichever loving kindness phrase you're using. We've voiced a few. Then the next, once again, the other foot, may I have happiness and the causes of happiness. And then the other. And that way you do walk your 10 steps. You slowly turn around and you do it again, walking backwards. Turn around, you do it again. And you do that for as long as the timer is ticking. So maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Some people like to do more. Some people like to do less. Some people really enjoy walking meditation, even when it's drizzling and or misty or even raining. Some people like it dry and warm and sunny. It's just, we all have very different preferences. So whatever works. I mean, of course, please do put a raincoat if you're doing it under pouring rain, but this is where there's creative freedom. But the idea is that with each step, we're going deeply into the aspiration once again. So that's the formal practice. The informal practice is happening when we're simply walking somewhere, maybe even around the stupa or towards the supermarket or walking with our dog. But the main purpose of why we're there is to walk somewhere or to be on a walk. It's not to walk 10 mindful steps back and forth all the time. However, even that process of simply walking, we can combine with loving kindness. So how do we do that? Well, when there's no one around us, well, it's just us. No squirrels, not even the dog, no birds, just us and, I don't know, the lovely natural environment around us. As long as it's just us, or maybe an empty street, we think, may I be happy, be well and happy, be happy and have the causes of happiness, whichever phrase we're using once again. And we can use different phrases in different sessions. That wouldn't negatively affect the practice overall, because the essence is just wishing happiness and its causes. It's not so much about which words we use, even though the words have to be clear and intelligible. But we do that, but then suddenly a squirrel comes into the picture, or some tourists, or some other people appear in the street. Or maybe you are already on a busy street, so there are 70 people ahead of you, you can see them in the distance, and maybe also some dogs, as it happens here in Nepal. So on any given day, when it's during the day, I would see people and dogs, and on occasion, squirrels and crows and so forth. So then what I do is I focus on all of us together. I think, may we be happy, have the causes of happiness. All of us right here. Doesn't mean I'm excluding others from that, but these are the beings on the street that I can see in the circle, in the sphere of my perception, in the bubble of my perception. May we be happy and have the causes of happiness. So that already, in my experience, strongly changes the way I feel about my day and about these beings and about myself and even about that street. That's meaningful. And that I'm also strengthening my quality of loving kindness, my ability to generate loving kindness. So that's how to do 2 styles of walking meditation, one formal, one informal. Are there other ways of doing loving kindness walking practice? Absolutely, many options, but let's focus on these 2 first and experiment with them. So that I would very much suggest that as part of our exploration for the ensuing week, we do some informal practice, just inserting some thoughts of loving kindness here and there. And we do walking meditation as well, formally or informally, or both, depending on what your circumstances and your time allow. And then, of course, to continue looking at how our mind feels as we're doing all these practices, because that's important. Is there a tiny shift? Is there a glimpse here or there? Do we notice the obstacles arising in our mind? So that's an exploration. So then a little bit of, let's add a bit more context in our remaining minutes. It's important because otherwise we'll just spend whole 10 classes on loving kindness and never move forward. But I do want to add these considerations here, and then also say that in the practices that we're going to be doing formally between now and the next week, we can still do mostly loving kindness for ourselves. That's absolutely fine, using any of the recordings from the preceding week. Or we can slowly start exploring practices where we also extend loving kindness to another being. So for that, we need a little bit more detail, and that's where these slides come in. And before that, once again, a reminder about the duo of mindfulness and introspection, two mental functions or mental factors, as they're called. Mental factors means mental function. That's the meaning, essentially. They are parts of our psyche, parts of our mind that add detail to our cognition of reality. And Buddhist psychology gives a very precise description of each mental function, each of the key mental functions that we have. It's not an exhaustive list that it presents, this system of knowledge presents, but very helpful because it, for example, very, very precisely talks about how the process of concentration happens as multiple functions come together, or the process of loving kindness. So to generate loving kindness, we do still need mindfulness, which is, in this case, defined as bearing in mind, or not forgetfulness with regards to something. And we do need introspection, which is this repeated scanning of our body and mind to check, hey, what's happening there? Am I distracted? But for loving kindness practice, formal or informal, mindfulness and introspection start working in a more specific way than we have previously discussed. So there are still specific modulations of our awareness, and they still hold the same definitions of non-forgetfulness or bearing in mind and scanning our body and mind to check them for something. But in this case, to be more precise, mindfulness is mindfulness of the object of our attitude, in this case, loving kindness. Later on, it will be compassion and so forth, and the ways of cognizing it. That's what's important, not just the object. Just the object, just concentrating on myself. Well, that's just concentrating on myself. Okay, I'm here. I'm aware of it. In the same way I would be aware of the presence of the pen. Okay, the pen is here. So being aware of the pen is not loving kindness practice, right? And just concentrating on the presence of the pen. It can be a concentration practice, not very exciting because it's kind of a boring object, relatively speaking, compared to the mind or the breath or a visualized image, but okay, it's an object. So similarly, concentrating on myself and just bearing myself in mind, that's not yet loving kindness. What mindfulness also needs to hold is the attitude of wishing for happiness and the causes of happiness. That's what also needs to be borne in mind. Bearing in mind also applies to that. So when both things are, we are bearing in mind both things, the object and the way of cognizing it, wishing for happiness and the cause of happiness, then mindfulness is working properly here. With introspection, we sometimes check. Well, first we check the body, actually, as in, is it slouching? Is it tired? What's happening with my posture? Am I breathing naturally? Am I holding the breath by accident? Sometimes happens. But beyond that, that's kind of more foundational and is applicable in every practice. Beyond that, introspection checks whether the mind is still holding the object. Because of course, if we have become distracted by thoughts of upcoming lunch, well, it means we do need to then return to the object, restore mindfulness, and so forth. But if the object, meaning the person, is still in the mind, okay, that's good. But also introspection is checking whether we're recognizing that object in the necessary manner, that is, through the lens of loving kindness. Because once again, if I'm focused on myself, but I'm drowning in critical thoughts about myself, that's not going to lead to the development of loving kindness. So I need to snap out of it. Or maybe I'm focused on someone else. I've really reached the stage where I can try to cultivate loving kindness for a so-called enemy, that is a person I don't like, right? So I project loving kindness towards them, I rest in it, and then at a certain point, instead of loving kindness, it's just me thinking bad things about this person. And then the question is not really, are they valid or not? Is this really an evildoer or not? Not the point at all here. The point is that if I'm lost in negative thoughts about that person, I'm no longer using the practice of loving kindness, of cultivating loving kindness properly. So that's something else that I need to snap out of it. I need to refocus properly. Ooh, loving kindness. May you be happy and have the causes of happiness. Remodulating my awareness, reshaping it, taking the clay of my awareness, and instead of what it turned into on its own, like dough, you left it in the bowl, you were making sourdough bread and you left it to its own devices, and things happened to it, and now it's, growing and changing, and it acquired a new shape, and it's all puffy and weird. So the same thing with our mind, we left it to its own devices by becoming not too mindful, and instead of loving kindness, it turned into this weird doughy thing of, I don't know, criticism or maybe craving desire or sexual fantasies and so forth. And all these things tend to happen sometimes in loving kindness practice. But then we need to reshape it, like a master baker. You take it, you turn it back into whatever it is you were planning to turn it into, like a nice, wonderful focaccia. And then you put it in, you send it to the oven, and it comes out and you eat it. Oh, wouldn't that be lovely? So that's the discussion of mental factors, and it's important to keep them in mind outside of our practice. Just sometimes ask ourselves, am I using mindfulness? Am I using introspection properly? And also inside our practice, they're implicit in these meditations. So even if you're listening to, even when you are listening to a guided meditation with Dr. Wallace, for example, or any of our other teachers, guided meditation, loving kindness, in those practices, for example, Dr. Wallace would make references to mindfulness and introspection less often than in guided meditations for mindfulness of breathing, because mindfulness of breathing is quite often used as the teaching platform to really understand how does mindfulness, how does introspection work. And then we just take that knowledge and we apply it to any and every other meditation. But if we start with loving kindness as our concentration practice, primary practice for now, we need to bring this understanding in ourselves, and then slowly keep modulating our awareness in masterful, skillful, creative ways. So then to return to the definition of loving kindness and to restate it, Maitri is the Sanskrit term, Metta is the Pali term, very popular word these days. I think I'm mentioning this again and again, but there's even a basketball player in the United States who officially changed his legal name to Metta World Peace. And that's a fun thing to do. And it's a beautiful word. Maitri is the beautiful word, which is related to the name of the future Buddha that will, in Buddhist cosmology, come at a very distant point in the future. Very distant as in don't hold thy breath, not happening 5 years or 10 years from now. In no system, I don't know of any traditional system that says it will happen anytime soon, as in our lifetimes, really. And in some cases, it's like 70 million years, like they're very, very large numbers. But beyond that, the idea there, of course, the big promise or the inspiring idea is that at some point in the future, there will be enough causes for a person to come into this world, or in Thich Nhat Hanh's thinking, maybe a community rather than a person. For a person or a community to come through that would fully embody the quality of loving kindness. So quality of loving kindness is Maitri, and this idealized cosmological figure of a future Buddha or Buddhic community, once again in Thich Nhat Hanh's thinking, that would bear that. Their Sanskrit name is Maitreya. And I'm just making reference to that because some people, of course, have heard that name, but maybe not everyone is sure what it's related to. So Maitreya is the one who possesses Maitri, loving kindness, to its fullness, immeasurable, in an immeasurable way, so much that it radiates from every pore and inspires and transforms everyone. And there are practices associated with the image of Maitreya, the mantra of Maitreya, and so forth, all of those supposedly able to strengthen our loving kindness even further. But I'd never seen it said that we could just, for example, do those visualizations or recite those mantras and not meditate on loving kindness and thus still acquire loving kindness. No, we still need to do the actual practice. And we do the actual practice by taking our mind, taking our awareness, right? Our ability to be aware and shaping it into the wish for beings to have happiness and the causes of happiness. And this is a wonderful quote from Jigme Lingpa. Jigme Lingpa is one of my favorite Tibetan authors and contemplatives, an incredible yogi of the Nyingma tradition, but kind of universally respected by all and very influential figure in the Great Perfection tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. Jigme Lingpa wrote many wonderful texts, some of them absolutely quintessential for his tradition. And in one of them, there's a whole chapter on the Four Immeasurables that we're going to be quoting from a lot is in these short snippets. So when talking about what loving kindness is, or Maitri or love, Jigme Lingpa writes, love means wishing for the happiness of others, like a loving mother cherishing her child. So one of the suggested readings for this class in between now and then will be a very short text from the Buddha, or from the words of the Buddha in the Pali tradition, called Karaniya Metta Sutta, which is essentially Buddha's discourse on loving kindness. And in that very, very famous text, which Dr. Wallace quotes from all the time when he teaches these practices, and you would see that text referenced in so many other sources on the Four Immeasurables or Four Brahma Viharas. In that text, the Buddha also says, just like a mother holding her child, her only child, should one project loving kindness to all beings. That's a paraphrase. So here, it is like a mother holding her newborn child, or in some cases, the analogy given is not even a mother already holding her child. The mother waiting for her child to arrive, as in be born. The child is already in the womb. The child is fully developed. You know, the mother is 9 months pregnant. Some of my friends are, and some of my colleagues are right now. But then the mother, with a lot of tenderness, puts her hand on the tummy, and she thinks about that child. So first, what comes through is, of course, tenderness for that being. But beyond tenderness, there's also the wish, may you be happy. Once you come into this world, first of all, may you come through in a painless, safe manner. It's like, may the process of birth not be too traumatizing for anyone involved. But beyond that, may you find success and joy and well-being and be healthy and live a long life and be loved and be respected and feel that you're loved and respected and feel that your existence matters and that you should exist and it's not for nothing. So all these wishes and aspirations, as if a mother was holding her child. So in the same way, we become this mother. These practices are very motherly, and all four immeasurables have a specific association with them in the life of, or the interaction of a parent and a child. We'll look at those when we go through all four of them. But in this case, that's the analogy. The mother thinking about her newborn child and not yet born child, but sort of ready to come through and already wishing, may you find all the types of success and well-being and joy. Naturally, it naturally comes through normally, or if everything is balanced. Of course, there are exceptions, but we're talking about a metaphor or an analogy, just that. Yeah, this wonderful quote is translated by Padmakara Translations. We're going to use a lot of their translations, usually or quite often published by Shambhala Publications. That's the source of the quote. But yeah, love means wishing for the happiness of others, like a loving mother cherishing her child. So that's another mental exercise that we can do, even as we're walking the street, projecting our kindness to everyone around us, as if we were their loving mother, or as if we were holding them in the, and that's a word frequently used in Buddhist tradition in general, but especially in the Sanskrit tradition, as if we were holding them in the womb of our awareness, like this, the welcoming, boundless, loving space. They sort of do enter that space, the space of loving kindness. So I used another analogy before, the eyes of loving kindness, the eyes of empathy, the eyes of compassion. And here we can talk about the space of loving kindness in which we gather beings. And while they're there, they're being saturated by our wish, may you be happy and have the causes of happiness. In this case, there's a question here, can we get a link to the Berzin commentary on the 5 hindrances? Said you would include it in email. I think in this case, well, there's the commentary by Dr. Wallace in the book, but I think I don't particularly know of a Berzin commentary to the 5 hindrances, but the one that I like is Sylvia Boorstein's, a sort of playful way of describing them. I'll see if it's available online. Otherwise, I can only reference the book that it's from, but we'll see. Yeah, we'll include something in the link. And this actually brings us to this slide, which is the last thing we're probably going to discuss before we finish this class for today, with a little bit of silence and restfulness. But obstacles in cultivating loving kindness, which you would read about in the chapter on loving kindness in the Four Immeasurables book. False facsimile, affliction being removed, and then all the 5 hindrances. So false facsimile, which we will discuss a little bit more when we talk about extending loving kindness from us to so-called friends or loved ones, is sort of a convoluted version of loving kindness, where instead of just freely wishing for someone to be happy, we put a lot of conditions on that. Only if you're with me, or only on my conditions, or only if you do this and that and the other thing, and you follow this religion, and then you turn into this, and then you become that, and so forth. So not wishing happiness freely, but wanting to possess and control the object instead, and then they can have some joy. So similar states, and usually in our mind, they're fully fused, especially in interpersonal relationships. But slowly, we can remove this neurotic aspect, lessen it at least. Even if the complete transcendence of it would happen in the very long run, or with a lot of wisdom, but at least lessening it and strengthening the wholesome component of loving kindness or love proper. And then the affliction being removed is just anger and hatred. And in some cases, it's just described as not wishing for someone to be happy and to have the causes of happiness. So if we were to look at two people, to one person with loving kindness, we would perhaps say, yeah, maybe may you be happy and have the cause of happiness, because they're maybe quite neutral to us or even friendly. And then the other person will look at, yeah, not so much for you. So that mental state. And this is actually something that we might have already noticed with ourselves, but we might also have noticed the neurotic attachment of saying, yeah, you can be happy, but only if you're successful with all these projects and you bring benefit to the world and enough people thank you, and the list goes on. Only if can you be happy. Can I wish for you to be happy? And then with anger and hatred, maybe in some cases even feeling, yeah, not for you, not you. Well, like you can disappear. You don't have to be here. You don't deserve to be here. You don't belong. You don't deserve to be happy. So that mental state, even in ourselves, we can already notice it, let alone when we start actively contemplating other beings, which is the next step. But we'll experiment perhaps with some more loving kindness for ourselves, formal and informal practice, and walking meditation on loving kindness. And then we'll see how it all unfolds. And with regards to all the 5 hindrances, they're mentioned here because these 5 afflictive energies that are clearly described in the Pali tradition. But once again, Dr. Wallace lists them very clearly in the chapter on shamatha practice of our root text for Immeasurables. They're important here because they interfere with any concentration practice, including loving kindness. So they would be a problem in mindfulness of breathing. They would be somewhat of a problem in meditating on the visualized image, on a visualized image of any kind. There would be a problem in concentrating on the mind. Even if we just were trying to concentrate on a pen, there would be a problem. And similarly, of course, they also arise in the mind when we practice loving kindness. But sometimes the way they arise in each of these individual practices is unique, because each practice in itself is unique. So trying to cultivate a stable, all-encompassing state of loving kindness, attitude of loving kindness is not exactly the same as observing the sensations in the body. And from that point of view, the individual modulations of these 5 hindrances might be fun and interesting to observe. They might be unique. And yet in the long run, we will need to transform, release, overcome all of them, replacing them with the so-called 5 factors of absorption, or dhyanic factors, that are also described in the 3rd chapter of the book. So let's explore these, try to observe them, notice them, and then next time we'll have so much more practical experience to talk about with each other. And our next steps in this journey would be then projecting loving kindness to others, talking about the benefits of loving kindness from a psychological and Buddhist, quote unquote, Buddhist point of view, to more traditional and more modern points of view. That's how we're going to put it next time. And then after that, after we've concluded this overall overview of loving kindness, we'll go into a discussion of compassion, and we'll see how it's actually not that much that needs to be changed for us to start mastering this whole other practice, which is also very closely related to the original one we're working with right now, loving kindness. So that's what we'll do next time. And for now, let's mentally find joy in everything meaningful that we've done today. Discussion, the sharing, it was absolutely beautiful to see everything that you've shared, and it was an honor to read that all aloud. All these thoughts about formal, informal practice, things that we might start applying, thinking about how we can expand our formal practice and make it more stable and regular, and how much we can enjoy loving kindness and tenderness for ourselves as they continue unfolding. So all of that, may all these types of effort continue ripening in our mind until we and all beings master all the 4 immeasurables, and the whole world becomes the radiant space of loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimous openness. May it be so. With that, wishing you all a very pleasant evening, morning, day, or night, and hoping to see you all next time. Once again, we will be seeing each other in Andy Wilson's class, and then in our next class on this course as well. And just wishing you lots of joy. Thank you so much. And I think that's pretty much it for today.
Thank you, Tenpa.
Thank you all. Bye-bye. Rest well.